It is my pleasure to introduce our keynote speaker, Dr. Cathy ONeil. Cathy earned her PhD in mathematics from Harvard and began her career as a math professor at Barnard College. She then transitioned to the private sector, working as a quant in the hedge fund D.E. Shaw, and later as a data scientist in the New York startup scene. She is the author of an influential book, I love the name, Weapons of Math Destruction, How Big Data Increases Inequity and Threatens Democracy, which was published in 2016, and then The Shame Machine, Who Profits in the New Age of Humiliation, published in 2022. She's also the CEO of Orca, an algorithmic auditing company. Today, Cathy will be presenting on the topic, Auditing Algorithms. In her talk, she will share her approach for auditing algorithms, including how to contextually derive metrics of fairness, with plenty of examples to illustrate her points. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Cathy ONeil.
So thank you so much. I really appreciate being here. It's wonderful to see you all. I actually, okay, now I'm worried that my keynote is not available. Here comes a tech person. I'll just introduce myself for a second. I became a data scientist when it was like a new term, and I was like, what's a data scientist? And I decided to just pretend I was one. And it turns out it was totally possible, because predicting people, which is what data science does, is very similar to predicting markets, which is what I was doing as a quant. Thank you so much. And can you hear me now? Oh yeah, everything is working. Everything's coming up daisies, people. When I became a data scientist, and I should mention that I was a quant during the crisis, during the financial crisis. And the very first weapon of math destruction I encountered was the AAA ratings on mortgage-backed security, which you guys are too young to remember, but blew up the housing market because they made people believe that housing could never have a crisis. And it was bullshit, right? It was just a bad lie. It was a mathematical lie. And I was like, wow, this is not just a mathematical lie, but it's like nobody understands it except the people gaming it and the investment banks, and like it's really destructive. And it's really important. And the fourth thing it was obvious. Like it was obvious that it had been a lie in retrospect. But those first three properties, which is that they're big and important, they're mysterious, nobody really gets them except if you're gaming them, and that they are painful and destructive, those first three things I saw happening in data science without the fourth thing. Remember, the fourth thing is that it's obvious. Like everybody knew about the financial crisis, right? But what I was realizing is that you'd have these algorithms happening in data science that nobody understood, not even the victims, not even the people being harmed by them, especially those people, know why this had happened to them. They didn't know that everything was an algorithm. And so I'm just gonna back up and say what an algorithm is to me. This is my son. He is 16 now, but he still eats Nutella that much. The algorithm for me is like something predicting the future based on patterns in the past. So for me, and this is a first example in my book, making dinner for my family. I just look at the data here is in my brain, but it's still, I'm predicting a future success based on the patterns in the past. Now, my definition of success is, did my kids eat vegetables? That's not my kids' definitions of success, still not, right? Which means that we're gonna have a very different set of dinners in the future as I update my model. Yes, they ate broccoli, yes, they ate carrots. Then he would have me build, right? So just to be clear, for me, there's two sort of really big things with algorithms that can go wrong, that can harm people, the stakeholders of the system. Number one is the data itself could be problematic. Number two is the definition of success could be problematic, which is to say, what are you actually trying to predict? What are you optimizing to? It's for me to be in charge of dinners for my family. I am the mom. But what you want to think about is all these algorithms I'm going to talk about, why is it appropriate for the person who owns it and deploys it to be the one choosing definition of success for you if you're affected by it, because we are all affected by it. That was the point of my book, is that like literally every bureaucracy that we touch during our lives, whether it's getting into college, getting a job, getting a loan, maybe going to prison, like all of those things are now bureaucratic, like they're algorithms. They're all being done by algorithms. And that's not necessarily a bad thing. In fact, it's probably never gonna change. But what we wanna make sure of is that the patterns from the past that they train on are not just propagating or even expanding on problematic histories. So, for example, I interviewed this woman who got fired based on an algorithm. This was called the value-added model for teachers. It was a system of accountability for the teaching profession, which was itself not accountable. It was mostly a random number generator, but it was used to fire people or give them bonuses. And by the way, that's not across the country. It was only mostly used in high-stakes situations like that for urban centers. So in other words, for teachers of poor children. And it was really bad. It was arbitrary and punishing, and those poor children had much more churn for their teachers, which is bad for them, for their educational system. And as a result, poor children were like damaged by this, not rich children. In the suburbs, they did get scored, but they didn't get fired based on their score. I also wanted to mention that that's an old example, but a more recent example coming from healthcare, from Optum, was an algorithm that they built based on historical data to give concierge service to patients with medical complexity. The idea being that if you have a medically complex situation, you don't want to have an unnecessary drug or treatment that's actually bad for you. And that does happen. It's also very expensive, so it makes sense that a health insurance company wants to avoid that as well. So the idea is this win-win, like we're gonna help you navigate the system and to avoid unnecessary treatments. But the problem is that they actually trained it on a proxy for success. So remember, the definition of success is hugely important. They trained it mostly on historical cost of care. And again, there's a relationship between people with medical complexity and cost of care. More medical complexity tends to go with more cost, but that's not always the case, right? There's populations of people that have medical complexity but didn't actually get treated historically. And when I say historically, I mean right now, actually. Historical data could be last week. But that is, in particular, true for African American patients. So as a result, this algorithm did not offer this concierge service sufficiently to Black patients. We know this because Ziad Obermeyer, who's a data scientist and a doctor, got access to some of the data of this algorithm being used in a healthcare system, I think at a hospital setting, and figured this out, and also suggested a new algorithm that did this better, where the proxy for medical complexity was much more based on medical complexity. So it's a much closer proxy, I should say. This is like cutting out a lot, right? It's annoying. I'll stand over here then. I also want to mention another example, which is facial recognition, because this is kind of an interesting example. It's well known. My friends, Joy Bulamwini, Deborah Aji, Timnit Gebru, they did this gender shade study and figured out that not just Amazon, but IBM and I forget another big company, they all had these like facial recognition systems out there. They tested them and they found that even though they were sort of bragging at an accuracy of very close to 100%, it was actually very different depending on this color of your skin and your gender. And I should also mention your age. But they found out that, for example, for Amazon, it was 69% accurate for Black women and versus 100% accurate for white men in their testing data set. I bring this example up for a reason, which is that until you know how this is being used, we don't actually know if this is truly inappropriate or not. Like, this is not good. Like, you should be testing this stuff But you remember in the Optum example, I told you exactly how the outcome worked. Like if you got a high medical complexity score, then you get offered a service, which is to say if you have a low medical complexity score, you get denied a service. There's a harm there. But I didn't tell you the context of this facial recognition system yet. And that leads me to the sort of main 3 questions I grapple with in my work as an algorithmic auditor. The first one is, how is this algorithm being used exactly? Because until I know the human consequences of an algorithm, I don't know if it's good or bad. And one of the puzzles I like to do with myself, it's a riddle, if you will, is taking any algorithm that is being used for bad and figuring out how could that be used for good. And it's actually always possible in my experience. I liked the Krovos's line, when we do better, we do better. One of the things I realized as a data scientist pretty early on is that my job was mostly to make lucky people luckier and unlucky people unluckier. Basically, I would score people based on their position, whether that was wealth or gender or race, and I would basically say, people like you had got this in the past, so you're getting this in the future. So we're like continuing the future that we saw in the past. But we could, of course, do the opposite. Sometimes the constraints of capitalism make it harder to do that. But I just want to say that theoretically, we could make lucky people or unlucky people luckier. That could happen. And so that's what the kind of thing I want you to leave this talk with, is like, you can't actually say an algorithm is bad. You can say an algorithm being used in a bad way is bad. And that leads to the very difficult and important question of what do we mean by fairness? Because, when we hear that like the Apple Card was being scolded for having sexism on Twitter a couple years ago, what does that mean? What does it mean for a credit card offer to be sexist? Exactly. And that is the kind of question I work on a daily basis. And I'm hoping to give you a gist of the kind of work I do in this talk. And then, of course, the main point of that is going to be that it depends on the context. I'm actually not doing the ethics there. I'm always relying on the person in charge of ethics to be doing the ethics. When I say ethics, usually it's a lawyer, so it's mostly law, or it's a regulator, so it's like regulating. And it's, the idea is the public, they're accountable to the public good. So they're in charge of what we'll see as I call legitimate factors. And then they're also in charge of deciding when is a race gap too big? When is a gender gap too big? When is an ageism gap too big? That's what I call a threshold. So, but the first question is, how do you define a race gap? How do you define a gender gap? And I do really want to finish this in time for questions. So I'm going to maybe leave out some details so you guys can ask me some questions that you care about. There's 3 types of audits I do as an algorithmic auditor. One is, the one that I do a lot is I work for attorneys general, and they subpoena data, and we help them decide what is the data they need. We start with the English language sentence. I say to an AG, what is the English language sentence you want to tell the judge? I'm going to back out the data I would need to corroborate that if it's true. So if you want to say, this payday lending company is charging people for an insurance product that isn't acting as insurance, and it's making the effective APR much higher than the usury rate in the state, I'm like, okay, here's what I need. I need transaction level data so I can see how people are treated, blah, blah, blah. And it's also not optional. This is actually a situation, one of the very first adversarial audits that I did as a consultant for the state of Illinois. But that, in general, that's what we do, is like we talk to the AGs, they're like, we were worried about this, maybe consumer fraud, maybe like racist student lending, whatever. I'm like, what's the sentence you want to tell the judge? Here's the data we'll need for that. Give us the data. It takes a few months. Then we do the analysis. Then we write the expert report. The next is an invitational audit. This would be a private company where some people in the company decide they need to get their algorithm audited. Either that's because they feel personally like I I can't do this unless I get this audited, and they have some sway with the general counsel, because by the way, the general counsel is always the person that says no or yes. And typically my experience is that if the general counsel feels personally involved, then we get this job. We'd love to have way more invitational audits as a company, but right now we're waiting on incentives. We just had an economist here, so we're waiting on the regulators insisting on this. We're waiting on lawsuits that give them the impression that not doing it is going to be more expensive in the end than doing it. But right now it's like mostly they don't want to do it. And then finally, third-party audits. Usually a regulator will hire us. We just are working with the Colorado Insurance Commissioner. We also worked with the Insurance Commissioner of Washington, D.C. to audit car insurance and life insurance to see whether it's racist. So again, that's a very big question. So you have to say, what does it mean to be racist in the context of life insurance or car insurance? So I'm going to back out to a general audit. This is typically what the approach we use for invitational audits. We ask a very stupid question many, many times until it gets smart, which is, for whom might this fail? Which is to say, who are the stakeholders here? How could they be harmed by this? So remember my son who didn't get the dinners he wants. He would consider that harm. I'm the one in charge. He's the one who has to eat my food, right? That's a stakeholder. But that's not a very high stakes situation because he can always make himself a Nutella sandwich, which he does on a daily. But in other situations, like we're deciding whether you deserve this job, you don't get the interview. You don't know why. It might be because the algorithm was acting against you and you don't understand the algorithm. That's a very standard model for me. What's great about this ethical matrix building, which I'm going to talk about a little bit more, is that it's not a math question. So one of the campaigns I'm waging, as you probably have figured out, is just how much of this stuff is told to people. It's like, this is math, you wouldn't understand it. You're not technical, you don't have a PhD, so step away. But that's of course ridiculous when it comes to fairness. Fairness is something where everyone knows. No one says, oh, I'm not a fairness person. They say, no, I'm not a math person, which is sad, but they say it. But they don't say, I don't understand fairness, go talk to someone else. No, this is actually about fairness. It's only the last step where it's math or data science, really. And again, I don't want to oversell the ethical matrix as a process. It's different every time you do it with different stakeholder representatives, and it doesn't solve the problems, it just shows you what the problems are, at least the potential problems. And so you build basically a spreadsheet where the rows are stakeholders, and you interview stakeholder representatives, ask them, did we miss any stakeholders? What do you think could happen to people like you? And then we consider every cell in that two-dimensional grid, and it's pretty big sometimes. It's pretty big, but that's how you do it. Like you can't, it's like mathematically provably comprehensive, and you really can't do it in a more efficient way. It's not enough just to say, how could we get sued, right? That's not enough. Or how can we make money, which is typically the only question that was asked. I have a couple examples here. In the Optum example, I talked about earlier, Black patients are obviously a stakeholder. These are not complete, by the way. There's way more stakeholders, way more concerns. But what they'd be worried about is accuracy via false negatives. With facial recognition, Black women would certainly be concerned with accuracy, but until we know the context, we wouldn't know whether this is actually a problematic algorithm. It's possible that a judge seeing, like if it were being used in a courtroom, that there's a local law saying, if the accuracy is below 80%, you cannot use it as evidence. In which case they'd be like, okay, great, you can't use this as evidence. It's not actually acting against people. That's not a law anywhere I know, by the way. I'm just saying that you don't know until you know exactly the context. And I mention this because I do think it's easy to skip. Like I was actually on a panel with somebody from IBM, a vice president, who said, who boasted on a panel with me that they fixed their facial recognition. Now it's just as accurate for Black women as for white men. They did this, that's good. And then, but her conclusion was, now it's fair. And I was like, no, you can't say that it's fair until you know how it's being used. You cannot say it's fair. especially in the context of like the New York City police, which I know because I talked to a parole officer when I was writing my book, that the people in the database were the people that were processed during the stop and frisk era, which were basically all the black and brown men in the city. You know, I mean, as a slight exaggeration, but if only those people would be caught by this net, then that is not fair, right? It's a very, just like the teachers, only the teachers of poor kids were being fired based on that algorithm. So there's lots of ways to have bias. You don't have to have biased data. You can have biased application. That would make things unfair. Okay, now I want to talk about fairness a little bit more, because it's a big question, and sometimes people get really confused, especially in academia, where they talk about fairness as some kind of formula. It's not a formula. It's a negotiation where you use data science. And I'm going to give you an example. Oh no, I only have 5 minutes, damn it. I'm just going to give you one example. I know 15 minutes, but I wanted to have 10 minutes for a Q&A. I'm just going to give you one example. I'm cutting down people. Student lending. So we had an AG that hired us to look into racist student lending. There's lots of outcomes you might care about. One of them is who gets an offer of a loan, and then another outcome is what is the APR in that loan, what's the interest rate. It turns out in this case, everyone got an offer, everyone. But the interest rate might be really high. So that was what we cared about. So the very first thing we asked was, is it higher for black people, for black and Hispanic people versus white and Asian people? And the answer is yes, there was a gap. Okay, so that's the sort of origin of the race gap. But then the second question, so we would go to the AG and said, there's a race gap, it's big. And they went to their student lender, and the student lender's like, I can explain this. That's always what they'll say, I can explain this. We have a legitimate, we use FICO scores, and that's legitimate. And so this is an argument, this is the negotiation I talked about. It's an argument about what is legitimate. I'm not in charge of that, I'm just a nerd, okay? I just do the data. But the AG says, okay, that is illegitimate. And so so that's my cue to account for that. I account for FICO score. By the way, not my opinion. FICO scores are known to have a lot of correlation with race, but that was the thing that the AG decided. So I account for race, I account for FICO score, and then this gap goes down. I remeasure the gap after accounting for a legitimate factor. Then we go back and say, well, the gap is smaller, but it's still big. And the AG goes to the student lender, and the student lender says, I can explain. It's because we charge more for people with a ranking, US News and World Report ranking that's lower. And also we charge more for certain majors. And I'm like, why is that legitimate? Is that legitimate? Not my job, though. Just to be clear, this argument over legitimacy is an argument between lawyers, essentially, who represent the public good. It's not that they're unaccountable. They are accountable. You could do this at the regulatory level as well, and we do this for life insurance. What is appropriate if there's a gap? If there's a gap, a race gap, let's stick with that. What is appropriate to take into account? Well, it turns out age, turns out gender, turns out smoking status, even though smoking status is correlated with race. But you know what's not? FICO score. That would never be a legitimate factor in life insurance. And like vice versa, gender is not a legitimate factor in student lending. So that's when I'm telling you that you have to think about fairness in a context. This is what I mean. And you have to have that argument about what is legitimate, because all of these algorithms discriminate. That's the point of a scoring system, to discriminate. The question is it legitimate discrimination or is it illegitimate? And just to finish, the way we do it is we basically facilitate that negotiation, and then we account for legitimate factors, and then when we run out of legitimate factors, the remaining race gap is the race gap. That's what we call it. The race gap is what it started out with after accounting for the legitimate factors, which typically bring it down. And that's the sort of unexplained race gap, if you will. Okay, so I have to skip a lot of things over here, and one of those things is going to be addressed by Melissa in the next talk about local laws and how it's changing and how these things, and there's also privacy laws. You know what, I'm going to hand that stuff to you too, Melissa. I just want to say, the final thing I'll say is, when you build an ethical matrix, the idea is you're locating possible existential risks to your system for all stakeholders, with all the possible human harm that your algorithm could be leading to. And what you're doing, if you will, is designing a cockpit. Like an airplane cockpit. Like if you went on an airplane and you turn left and you didn't see a cockpit over there, you'd be like, I'm not flying on this plane, right? And you can think of every dial in a cockpit. I know they're on iPads now, but just bear with me. Every dial in an airplane cockpit is like a potential disaster you're trying to avoid. And so every one of these ethical matrix sort of cells that is red, I didn't tell you that's color-coded, but you saw that, that's a dial in your cockpit. You've got to measure that. You've got to say, and that's where the data science comes in. How do you measure possible racism in hiring algorithms? How do you measure it? It's the process I just told you about, like with legitimate factors. Let's build that dial in our cockpit for this algorithm, and you know that there's some threshold. If the race gap is higher than whatever percent, then it's unacceptable. It's unacceptable, and you have to land the plane. You have to like cancel. So that's the sort of metaphor that I like to use with respect to building audited algorithms. And I'll stop there for Q&A. Thank you.
Thank you so much for the great talk. So yeah, we have some questions.
Now that you've identified these kind of audit process and that, have you seen a decrease in the harm that is being done, or is there hope out there?
Oh, there's a lot of hope. There's a lot of hope. I mean, you know, let me go back to the payday loan situation I told you about. Like, at the end of the day, I had an expert report where I had a scatter plot. Each dot represented a customer for that payday lending company, and like the X coordinate was the amount of time, and the Y coordinate was like the effective APR, or the ratio of how much they paid versus how much they borrowed, and then I had a best fit line that showed that the effective APR for this business was more than 500%. And the judge took one look at this and said, yeah, you guys need to give restitution to these customers, because this was a big lie, right? And that was a huge success for me. I got to see people get money back. But what was depressing about it is that picture, which I thought was awesome, and it was very convincing, it was evanescent, like it just disappeared. And what I would like to see in the future is that every lending company, it has to, on a quarterly basis, just like an SEC filing, has to give in their data and show what their effective APR is, like a rule like that, which isn't happening yet, but it could happen if the CFPB became a little bit more activist in the future, if they're, you know, depending on the election. So my larger point is that, like, algorithms, on the one hand, can do a lot of harm, as is obvious, but they could also be held to account. And they don't lie. Like, the data doesn't lie, right? This is actually how you treated people. Here's the data. You need to do better. It's not passing this rule. This race gap is too high. This gender gap is too high. The APR is too high. You can keep track of all that and insist on better outcomes for humans. And the people building the algorithms, likewise, can do better. They can do better.
Hi. I'm wondering, over here, I'm wondering if you've ever been brought on board to do audits in like non-regulated industries?
Yes.
And if so, what are the motivators there that cause you to be brought on board?
As I said, it's usually like people who care, you know, and the general counsel, if they're a black woman, that will help a lot, especially after Ferguson. And it was just, it's very specific to the circumstances. And sometimes there's like, it's not exactly a regulated industry, but it's not that far, and they think maybe it'll eventually be swept up in one of these anti-discrimination law worlds. like an example would be like marketing. There's a lot of marketing where it's becoming more and more clear that like if you're trying to like hire someone or offer them insurance or credit or housing on social media, then you can't only market this to specific types of people, right? That Facebook until recently allowed people who were offering insurance products or credit products or housing or jobs, they allowed them till recently to just advertise to women or just to men or just to people under this age or something like that. It was just like, wait, how is that okay? And so I think it's like, and the answer was the industries just didn't think of that. The advertising industry didn't think it had to deal with those laws. So that also happens. But yeah, private companies will come forward if they're worried that the future will hold punishment for them not doing something, but also just if the people within the companies care.
Hi.
And have power. Yeah.
Hello.
Yeah.
Do you have any advice for those of us that might be in the workforce and having to contend with some of those scoring algorithms, or like on the job hunt, I guess? I might have to contend with some of those scoring algorithms to get interviews.
I'm so sorry, I can't really hear you. I asked, you said, do you have advice for somebody, and then I couldn't hear you.
That's okay. Would you have advice for somebody that might be on the job market right now and having to contend with some of those scoring algorithms?
I know there was a case recently where a guy applied to, he like applied to a single job, like in many attempts, and changed little things about his resume, except not his actual qualifications, and eventually got an interview, and then now he's like built a lawsuit out of that because it didn't change his qualifications. It changed like the sort of racialization of his first name. So like, I'm not saying that's always going to work to like modify an application on small things, but yeah, I guess I would probably have different varieties of my resume, because you never know what they're trying to pick up. Yes. Oh, hi. Great hair.
Thank you. Likewise. My name is Jennifer. I'm with UW Health, and just came back from an interesting conference in DC, and would like to hear you build a little bit more upon the thoughts you had on auditing, and think about a little bit about certification, specifically within the healthcare setting. Do we need to come up with some sort of auditing certification for some of these algorithms that we're using within healthcare to ensure that people are not just putting them in and letting them go and not circling back and re-looking at them going forward and tweaking them and making them better and reviewing outcomes? And would love to hear your thoughts on that.
Yeah, you guys probably noticed that I didn't talk about Gen AI much here. In part, that's because it's not being used as much yet for high stakes situations like I've discussed, like hiring and insurance yet. The exception, though, is healthcare. There is a lot of Gen AI being used in healthcare, for example, like summarization of doctor's visits, the triage of like if you send a note to your doctor through that medical portal, like it doesn't always go to your doctor now. Sometimes you get whisked away to somebody that might take longer to see it. And the question of like, are these things working and for whom are they failing? Really important questions. So yes, I helped NIST build a listening session for these very questions after the executive order came out a year ago. And unfortunately, that was stalled. And they don't have any money to do their work anyway. But that's not to say this isn't an urgent question. It's a very urgent question. And I will just say one word about how I would think about it, which is you have to build that cockpit. You have to think about who are the stakeholders that could be harmed. Obviously, I would worry the most about patients, and I would worry the most about vulnerable patients, whether that's because they have complex medical problems, or they don't speak English as a first language, or they're historically undertreated or poorly treated, and say, how is it working for those folks in particular? And the problem is that it's harder to nail a metric. So I was talking about dials, and as soon as I'm talking about dials, I'm thinking about a metric, right? A number, and I was talking about race gaps, so there's like between 0 and 100%, right? But when you're talking about natural language, it's not a number, so you have to turn it into a number somehow, and maybe in a bunch of ways to try to capture what could be going wrong for people. Or you have to do a bunch of spot checks where you're like, hi, Gen AI was used to help you. Did it work for you? Do you feel like this was a success? So be unsurprised and be actually happy if you get questions like that about Gen AI, because that means they're checking out whether it's working. And right now it's like throwing it up in the air and hoping Gen AI works perfectly. It doesn't. But it in particular in a situation like healthcare. By the way, healthcare is, for me, my white whale. I really want to work in healthcare because there's so many, never mind Gen AI, yes, there's so many medical diagnostic tools that are really problematic. Like, where did they come up with these things, you know? Like the kidney donor list, which had like a weighting against people of color until recently. Like, how did that happen, you know? But that was explicit. There's probably a lot of things that it's happening like more subtly.
What really concerns me is that nobody knows what's on and what's off. There's no references saying
Yeah,
AI
there's no transparency on how Gen AI is being used. I actually, and I know that we're at a university here, and I know it's upending education, and like kids are cheating widely with it. I think of it as the democratization of cheating, actually, because you know what I mean? It used to just be the rich kids with tutors that got to cheat, and now everyone gets to cheat. And I'm like, yeah, we're gonna have to figure out a new way to figure out whether kids have learned. And it's probably going to increase inequality yet more. That's the sad news. It's gonna make everyone better at what they do because they have help, but it's gonna make some people much better at what they do because they're gonna get those tutors to help them cheat better, you know? Yeah, sorry. I'm just ranting now. Yeah, please.
Hey, no worries. Long-time listener, first-time caller. So I have a question about deep neural networks. My understanding of it is that they are, or like dense layering, where the variables are opaque even unto themselves.
Yeah.
Have you ever had clients who kind of use that and tell you like, hey, we're not even sure what's feeding this thing? And do you recommend that they like put ethical Band-Aids as a layer on top of the dense neural network, or do you recommend that they just like switch to a more traditional ML model, where the variables are explicit?
Great question. I'm glad to be able to clarify that I don't care at all about how an algorithm works. I never look at source code. Nobody understands algorithms, including linear regressions. They're lying if they think they do. So, and in particular, you can't make an algorithm like non-racist by making sure that its input variables are non-racist. It just doesn't work that way. It's non-linear, and everything gets jumbled. So the only way I think you can validly audit algorithms is by seeing how does it affect people. And that requires a lot of data. Typically what I get to do, because I'm lucky, is I get to subpoena all of the data for the last 5 years on a lending company. Like every single person who applied for a loan, what happened to them? So it's enough data that I don't need to know how the algorithm works because I wouldn't be able to understand it anyway, and nobody else can either. Thank you. Yeah.
Have you had success in having stakeholders engage with you or other data scientists to, to set thresholds that are more fair and legitimate once you have explained, your 1 or 2 metrics? And what I feel about this is, it's our job as data scientists to create the best model, but it's the value judgment of what's fair and legitimate or what has business implications is on the stakeholders. And have you had success in them? Not just auditing, but, setting those thresholds.
So I don't have the power to set the thresholds, right? So let me tell you the best case scenario. When I work for a regulator, I'm measuring every single company in that space that works in under their aegis. And I can give the regulator in question a view onto the race gap for all of those companies. And so they can look at the race gaps and they can say, oh, there's a lot of people around here, because it's just a new number, right? For this product, the race gap is here. And there's some people that are doing really well, so we know you can do better than this. And there's some stragglers who are doing poorly. And so they can set a threshold where it's like, those stragglers have to get in line in the next year or two. And then they can set the threshold to be tighter over time because they know people can do much better. So that's the kind of idea, but it's not my job. I don't have power to set thresholds. I only have the power to give the view to the regulators on the kind of stuff that's happening out there.
Right, that's exactly what I was asking. And they engage with you to actually set the thresholds based on your inputs.
Again, I can't tell them what to do, but yeah.
You have an
Yeah.
online question.
Yeah.
As a woman of color who is often
Could you
told,
speak louder?
Yes. As a woman of color who has often been told she isn't a math person, what strategies or resources do you recommend for overcoming these stereotypes and building confidence in quantitative skills in tech as someone just entering the field?